The war room, aboard the Throne of Silence, smelled like recycled air and quiet fear. Though nobody in the room understood the fear yet. Nobody, except the old Admiral sitting at the head of the long black table. Fleet Admiral Vyrath Solenis had served the galactic hegemony for over 60 standard years, and in that time he had conquered 11 worlds, negotiated the surrender of 6 more, and personally overseen the pacification of an entire rebel star cluster in the Outer Veil. But none of that experience had prepared him for the words that had just come out of his sub-commander's mouth. Sub-Commander Kellis Dran stood at the far end of the room, her silver uniform crisp and perfect, her posture straight, her violet eyes bright with the unmistakable glow of someone who believed she had done something brilliant. She was young, barely 40 cycles, freshly promoted after a string of successful garrison deployments on compliant worlds, and she had the confidence of someone who had never truly been afraid. "The operation is already underway, Admiral," she said, and there was pride in her voice, real pride, the kind that made the older officers in the room shift in their seats. "I authorized the deployment 12 rotations ago, and initial reports suggest the native resistance is negligible." She tapped the holographic display, and a blue-green world floated into view above the table. A beautiful world, honestly, swirled with white clouds and vast oceans, and Vyrath felt his stomach drop the moment he saw it, because he recognized that world, not from any briefing, but from a file he had read once decades ago, a file that had given him nightmares for a month. "The planet is designated Sol 3 in our star charts," Quellis continued, "but the local inhabitants call it Earth. It has no faster-than-light capability, no energy shielding, no orbital defense infrastructure, and its political structure is fragmented into nearly 200 independent governing bodies that appear to be in constant low-grade conflict with each other. By every metric in the annexation handbook, this is a textbook target." She smiled when she said that, textbook target, and Vyrath wanted to scream. "I deployed 4 full legions," she said, "approximately 30,000 shock troops, with full armored support, atmospheric gunships, and a standard ground occupation kit. I expect total capitulation within 6 rotations, possibly fewer." The room was silent for a moment, the kind of silence that happens when people are waiting for applause. Quellis looked around, expecting approval, expecting the Admiral to nod, to commend her initiative. Instead, Vyrath spoke, and his voice was so quiet that the officers nearest to him had to lean forward to hear. "You sent troops to Earth?" Quellis blinked. "Yes, Admiral. As I said, the operation is—" "A Deathworld?" he whispered, and the word landed on the room like a hammer on glass. Nobody moved. Most of the officers in the room had never heard the term used in an operational context, because Deathworlds were something you studied in academy for exactly 1 lecture. A curiosity, a relic of old exploration logs from an era when the hegemony was still mapping the galaxy and losing ships to planets that ate them alive. Vyrath's hands were trembling, and he did not try to hide it. He reached across the table and pulled the holographic controls toward him, his fingers moving through menus that most officers didn't even know existed, deep into the Galactic Hazard Index, a database that hadn't been updated in thousands of years, because the worlds listed in it were worlds that nobody visited twice. He found the entry for Sol 3 and projected it above the table for everyone to see. The file was 8,247 standard years old. It had been written by a hegemony survey team, one of the early long-range exploration crews sent to catalog worlds in the Orion Spur. And it was immediately obvious that the team who wrote it had been terrified, because the language was not the dry clinical tone of a standard planetary assessment. It read like a warning, carved into stone. "Hostile biosphere," Vyrath read aloud, and his voice cracked on the words. "Apex predators present at every trophic level. Extreme geological and atmospheric instability, including massive tectonic activity, supervolcanic systems, and recurring extinction-level climate shifts. Dominant species, classified as adaptive persistence-hunting omnivores, with pack social aggression hierarchies, anomalous pain tolerance, and a documented cultural fixation on organized warfare. He paused and looked at Kellis, whose face had gone very still. "The recommendation at the bottom of this file," he said, "is 4 words long. It says observation only. Forever." The room was so quiet that Vyrath could hear the hum of the ship's engines through the floor. 2. "Do you know why no one has updated this file in 8,000 years, Sub-Commander?" he asked. And he did not wait for her to answer. "It is because no one has gone back. Not the hegemony, not the Telvari Syndicate, not the Kreth Dominion, not anyone. Every civilization that has found that world has looked at it and decided to leave it alone, and they were right to do so." Quellis opened her mouth and closed it again. For the first time since she had entered the room, she looked uncertain. "Admiral," she said carefully, "with respect, that file is 8,000 years old. The native species at the time of that survey was pre-industrial. They had no technology beyond basic metallurgy and animal domestication. Surely in the intervening millennia." "In the intervening millennia," Vyrath interrupted, and now his voice was not quiet anymore. Now it had an edge like broken metal. "They have only gotten more dangerous. They went from swords to nuclear weapons in less than 4,000 years, which is the fastest recorded technological acceleration of any species in the galactic record. They split the atom before they left their own atmosphere, Quellis. They built weapons capable of ending all life on their world, and then they kept building more of them, and they kept them pointed at each other, and they did not destroy themselves. Do you understand what that means?" Quellis did not answer. "It means they are insane," Vyrath said flatly, "and it means they are survivors. And those two things together make them the most dangerous species you could possibly have chosen to invade." He turned to his communications officer. "Get me a channel to the surface. Priority 1, emergency recall authorization. I want those legions pulled out immediately. Every single soldier. I don't care about the equipment. Leave it all. Just get them off that planet." The communications officer worked furiously at her console for almost a full minute before she looked up, and the expression on her face made Vyrath's blood go cold. "Admiral," she said, "I cannot reach the surface. Our long-range communications to the ground forces are being jammed." "By whom?" Kellis demanded. "Not by us, Sub-Commander. The jamming signal is originating from the planet's surface. It appears to be coming from multiple locations across several continents." The room absorbed this in silence. Vyrath sat back in his chair and closed his eyes. 30,000 soldiers were on the surface of the most dangerous planet in the known galaxy. They could not be reached, they could not be warned, and they had gone down there thinking they were walking into a routine subjugation. He opened his eyes and looked at Kellis Dran, and for the first time in 60 years of service, Fleet Admiral Vyrath Solenis did not know what to do. Legion Commander Torvan had fought on 9 worlds before Earth, and on every single one of them the pattern had been the same. The hegemony would land in force, the local species would resist for a few days, and then they would see the futility of fighting against superior technology, and they would surrender. And Torvan would set up a garrison and file his reports and move on to the next assignment. Earth was supposed to be no different. The landings went smoothly at first. 4 legions came down in 3 waves across 3 continents, targeting what hegemony intelligence had identified as major population and industrial centers. Central Europe, the North American Midwest, and the eastern coast of Asia. The dropships screamed through the atmosphere and hit the ground hard, and within the first hour, the shock troops had established perimeters and begun pushing outward into the surrounding cities. The first engagements were exactly what Torvan expected. Military forces responded quickly. Faster than most species, actually, but their weapons were crude ballistic firearms and explosive projectiles that barely scratched the hegemony's energy shields. And the first wave of human defenders fell in minutes. Torvon watched from his command walker as his troops advanced through a European city, stepping over the wreckage of human vehicles and scattered debris. And he thought to himself that this would be over in 3 days. He was wrong about that in a way that would cost him his life. The first sign of trouble came not from the humans, but from the planet itself. Within 12 hours of landing, hegemony soldiers began reporting physical distress. Earth's gravity was roughly 20% higher than hegemony standard, which meant that every soldier on the ground was carrying the equivalent of a heavy pack at all times, and their joints and spines were not built for it. Medics reported increasing cases of knee inflammation, spinal compression pain, and stress fractures in the feet and ankles. The atmosphere was worse. Earth's air was rich in oxygen, far richer than the hegemony homeworld, and the humidity in certain zones was so high that it corroded exposed sensor equipment and caused respiratory irritation in troops who removed their helmets even briefly. But the real horror was the microbial life. Hegemony medkits were designed to treat wounds inflicted by energy weapons and standard battlefield injuries on worlds with low biological diversity. They were completely useless against Earth's bacteria, which were ancient and aggressive and utterly alien to hegemony biology. A simple cut from a piece of broken glass became a raging infection within hours, because Earth's microorganisms did not recognize hegemony tissue as foreign, and they did not hesitate. They just consumed whatever they touched. 14 soldiers died from infected wounds in the first 3 days, not from combat, just from the planet. And then there was the wildlife. A supply convoy moving through the mountainous region of western North America was attacked and destroyed. And when the rescue team arrived, they found the wreckage scattered across a forest clearing. The initial assumption was a human ambush, but the forensic analysis told a different story. The convoy had been attacked by a single large animal, a creature the humans called a grizzly bear, which weighed over 400 kilograms and had claws capable of tearing through light vehicle armor. It had apparently wandered into the convoy's path and reacted to the noise and lights by doing what grizzly bears do, which was to destroy everything in the immediate area. In Southeast Asia, a reconnaissance unit lost 3 soldiers to something that lived in the water, a massive reptile called a saltwater crocodile that grabbed them from a riverbank and dragged them under before anyone could fire a shot. The unit had to be evacuated due to psychological trauma because they had never encountered a predator before. Not a real one, not something that hunted and killed with that kind of speed and power. Insect swarms disabled exposed sensor arrays. Venomous creatures that the humans apparently lived alongside without concern bit and stung soldiers who stumbled into their territory. And the weather itself turned hostile, with violent electrical storms, sudden temperature drops, and in one case, a massive rotating wind event that the humans called a tornado, which destroyed an entire forward operating base in the North American plains without any human involvement at all. Torvon began to understand why the old survey file had called this world a death world. But the wildlife and the weather were not the worst of it. The worst of it was the humans themselves. They did not surrender. They did not even consider it. Within 36 hours of the initial landing, scattered human military forces had regrouped and begun coordinating a response, and the speed of their adaptation was something that Torvon had never seen in any species. Human engineers captured hegemony weapons from fallen soldiers and began taking them apart, not carefully, not in laboratories, but right there on the battlefield, in bombed-out buildings and muddy trenches. They could not replicate the technology, not yet, but they figured out the shield frequencies within 2 days and began modifying their own crude weapons to punch through hegemony energy barriers. They used everything: bullets coated in improvised compounds, explosive devices built from scavenged alien power cells, electromagnetic pulse generators cobbled together from civilian electronics, and they fought in ways that the hegemony had no doctrine for. They did not form lines in advance. They did not hold territory and defend it in the traditional sense. They melted into their own terrain, became invisible. They hid in mountains and jungles and cave systems and the ruined shells of their own cities. And they struck from the shadows with a ferocity that Torvan's officers described in their reports as unhinged. A hegemony patrol would advance down a city street, and every window would be empty, and every building would be silent. And then suddenly gunfire would erupt from 6 directions at once, and the patrol would take casualties, and the humans would vanish before reinforcements arrived. They used the sewers, the subway tunnels, the rooftops, every hidden passage in their own infrastructure. And they knew every inch of it, because it was their home. Torvan stood in his command center on the 4th day and looked at the casualty reports and felt something he had not felt in his entire military career. He felt afraid. His troops were dying from infections they could not treat. They were exhausted from the crushing gravity and the relentless 24-hour light cycle that their bodies could not adjust to. They were being picked apart by an enemy that refused to stand and fight in the open. And the planet itself was attacking them with weather and wildlife and microscopic organisms that ate through their medical supplies. He had come to Earth expecting primitives. He had expected frightened creatures with crude weapons who would bow before the might of the hegemony the way every other species had. Instead, he had found a world that was trying to kill him from every direction, and a species that seemed to have been born for war. On the 5th day, Legion Commander Torvan did something that no hegemony ground commander had done in over a century. He sent a distress signal instead of a progress report. The message was short, and it carried a weight that made the communications officers on the throne of silence go pale when they received it. We are not conquering this world. This world is conquering us. Send reinforcements or send evacuation. We cannot hold. Up on the flagship, Admiral Vyrath read the message and said nothing for a very long time. He had known this was coming. He had known it from the moment he heard the word Earth. But knowing it and seeing it confirmed were two very different things. 30,000 soldiers were trapped on a planet that wanted them dead, surrounded by a species that had apparently decided that dying was preferable to surrender. 2 weeks after the landing, the hegemony's occupation of Earth was not just failing, it was being dismantled piece by piece by a species that had turned rage into a science. The humans had done something that the hegemony's political analysts said was impossible. They had unified, not completely and not without argument, but they had put aside generations of rivalry and suspicion and hatred in the span of days to focus on a single shared enemy. Nations that had been pointing weapons at each other for decades were suddenly sharing intelligence, pooling military resources, and coordinating joint operations across continents through communication networks that the hegemony could not fully disrupt, because the humans had built so many redundant systems that cutting one just activated 3 more. They called it Operation Spite, and the name itself told the hegemony everything it needed to know about the species it was fighting. The human joint command structure was messy. Generals from different nations shouted at each other in different languages across video links. Politicians interfered with military decisions, and there were at least 4 separate incidents where Allied forces nearly fired on each other due to miscommunication. But it worked. Not because it was elegant, but because the humans did not need elegance. They needed fury. And fury they had in abundance. The first major coordinated counterattack came on the 9th day, when a combined force of soldiers from 12 different nations launched a simultaneous assault on all 3 hegemony landing zones. The attacks were not identical. Each one was tailored to the local terrain and the composition of the human forces available, and that adaptability was what made them devastating. In North America, human armored divisions supported by attack helicopters hit the hegemony perimeter in a classic combined arms assault. The hegemony's energy shields held against the first wave. But the humans had learned. and the second wave came with modified weapons that punched through the shields like they were made of paper. The hegemony lost 2,000 soldiers in 6 hours and was forced to contract its perimeter by 30 kilometers. In East Asia, the approach was different. Instead of a frontal assault, human forces used their knowledge of the coastal terrain to launch amphibious raids on hegemony supply lines, cutting off forward bases from their logistics chain and starving them of ammunition and medical supplies. Hegemony commanders, who had never dealt with supply shortages before, discovered what it felt like to ration energy cells and water purification tablets. But the most devastating blow came in Europe, at the hegemony's largest forward operating base outside the city of Frankfurt. The siege of Frankfurt began on the 10th day and lasted 48 hours, and when it was over, it became the single largest hegemony ground defeat in 300 years of galactic military history. The human forces surrounded the base with a combined NATO-led army of over 60,000 soldiers, supported by artillery, drones, and improvised electronic warfare systems. The hegemony garrison of 8,000 troops activated their shields and prepared for a conventional siege, expecting the humans to grind against their defenses until reinforcements arrived. The humans did not do that. Instead, human combat engineers began tunneling. They dug under the base using construction equipment and mining tools, creating a network of passages beneath the hegemony's defensive perimeter. At the same time, human electronic warfare specialists used a captured hegemony communications relay and a civilian laptop computer to hack into the base's local battle network. And they did not just disrupt it, they fed false data into it, making the hegemony's tactical displays show phantom units and fake attack vectors, while the real assault came from underground. The tunnelers broke through the floor of the base's primary power facility and planted explosive charges that they had built from hegemony plasma cells wired to human-made detonators. When the charges went off, the base lost power, the shields dropped, and 60,000 humans poured through the perimeter from every direction at once. The garrison fell in less than 2 days. Over 3,000 hegemony soldiers were killed, and nearly 5,000 were captured. The humans treated the prisoners with rough efficiency, confiscating weapons and equipment, but providing food and basic medical care, which confused the captured soldiers because they had been told that Deathworld species showed no mercy. The hegemony's morale, already fragile, shattered completely after Frankfurt. And then there was the matter of the nuclear weapons. Hegemony intelligence had known that humans possessed atomic weapons. It was in the initial survey data, but they had dramatically underestimated the scale. And when a full accounting was finally completed, using intercepted human communications and satellite imagery, the number that came back made every officer on the throne of silence go very quiet. The humans had approximately 12,000 thermonuclear warheads, enough to sterilize the surface of their own planet several times over, and they had delivery systems capable of reaching low orbit. The hegemony's fleet commanders immediately recognized the threat and began calculating evasive scenarios, but the humans had already anticipated that. Through a broadcast on every frequency they could reach, including ones they had stolen from the hegemony's own communications array, humanity's Joint Command sent a message directed at the fleet in orbit. The message was translated into hegemony standard language with surprising accuracy, which meant the humans had already begun decoding alien linguistics. "We know you can burn our world from orbit. We want you to know that if you do, we will launch everything we have, not at your fleet, because we probably cannot reach your largest ships yet, but at your soldiers on our ground, at your bases, at every piece of alien infrastructure on this planet, and at ourselves if we must. If you turn our world to glass, we will make sure your army burns with it. This is not a negotiation. This is a promise." The hegemony's behavioral analysts studied the message and ran it through every deception detection model they had, and every single model returned the same result. The humans were not bluffing. They meant every word, and they would do exactly what they said they would do. Meanwhile, on the ground, the daily reality of fighting humans was destroying the hegemony soldiers psychologically in ways that no training had prepared them for. Human soldiers fought in rotating shifts, sleeping in 4-hour blocks, then returning to combat with a relentless rhythm that the hegemony could not match. Their troops needed 10 hours of rest per cycle, and could not function in Earth's punishing 24-hour day without severe cognitive decline. The humans exploited this mercilessly, launching their heaviest attacks during the hours when hegemony troops were at their weakest. Intercepted human communications revealed something that the hegemony psychologists flagged as deeply disturbing. The human soldiers were laughing. They were joking with each other over their radios while under fire. They were singing songs and making crude jokes about their enemy, and competing with each other over kill counts like it was a game. One human sniper in the ruins of a European city left a handwritten note pinned to the chest of a dead hegemony officer, and when it was translated, it read, "Welcome to Earth. Checkout is mandatory." The hegemony's morale officers classified this behavior as evidence of mass psychological breakdown, but the human psychologists who were consulted through intercepted academic communications had a different term for it. They called it coping, and they said it was normal, and that fact alone was more frightening than anything else. On the 14th day, Legion Commander Torvan was killed. He was traveling between defensive positions in an armored transport when the vehicle passed over a section of road that had been prepared by human resistance fighters. The device was an improvised explosive built from a salvaged hegemony plasma cell connected to a human-made pressure detonator, and it was constructed by a 19-year-old engineering student from Munich who had never held a weapon before the invasion. The explosion killed Torvan instantly and destroyed the transport completely. When hegemony recovery teams arrived, they found the wreckage surrounded by human fighters who had already stripped it of usable technology. Into the city. With Torvan dead, command of the ground forces fell to officers who were exhausted, demoralized, and increasingly convinced that they had been sent to die on a world that was never meant to be conquered. The daily casualty reports told the story. 30,000 soldiers had landed on Earth, and in 2 weeks that number had fallen to less than 18,000, with losses accelerating every day as the humans grew more organized, more creative, and more angry. Up on the throne of silence, Admiral Vyrath read each report in silence, and felt the weight of what was happening settle on his shoulders like the gravity of the planet below. He had known this would happen, he had tried to stop it, and now all he could do was watch as the most dangerous species in the galaxy taught the hegemony a lesson that it would never forget. The humans did not stop, they did not tire, they did not negotiate, they did not ask for terms, they just kept fighting, hour by hour, after hour, day after day, with a fury that burned like their own sun. Admiral Vyrath had not slept in 3 days, and the darkness under his eyes had become so deep that his officers had stopped looking directly at his face because the exhaustion there was frightening. He sat in his command chair on the bridge of the Throne of Silence and stared at the tactical display showing the blue-green world below, and he thought about the fact that he was going to have to make a decision that would follow him for the rest of his life, no matter which way he chose. The numbers were simple and terrible. Of the 30,000 soldiers who had landed on Earth, fewer than 11,000 were still combat capable, and that number was dropping by the hundreds every day. The rest were dead, captured, wounded beyond the ability of field medics to treat, were so psychologically broken that they could no longer hold a weapon. The ground forces were requesting emergency evacuation with increasing desperation, and their messages had taken on a tone that Vyrath recognized from his decades of service, the tone of soldiers who understood that they had been abandoned. But evacuation was no longer a simple matter either, because the humans had turned their eyes toward the sky. In the 2 weeks since the invasion, Earth's nations had launched an astonishing flurry of improvised orbital countermeasures. They had taken their existing missile systems, the ones they had built to threaten each other, and reprogrammed them to reach low orbit. They had retrofitted commercial rockets with explosive payloads and launched them on suicide trajectories toward the hegemony fleet. They had even packed civilian spacecraft, the crude capsules they used for their early space exploration programs, with improvised warheads, and fired them upward with no guidance systems at all, just raw thrust and hope. Most of these attempts failed. The hegemony's point defense systems shot them down easily, but 3 of them got through, and 3 hegemony. Frigates now bore scorch marks and hull breaches from human-made explosives that should not have been capable of damaging starships, but somehow were. The humans were learning orbital mechanics in real time. Their scientists and engineers were calculating trajectories, adjusting launch windows, and improving their improvised weapons with every attempt. They were failing 90% of the time, but they were getting better. And the trend line made the hegemony's fleet commanders deeply uncomfortable because it suggested that within another few weeks, the humans would have something that actually resembled an anti-ship capability, built entirely from civilian infrastructure and sheer determination. Vyrath called a council of his senior staff, and the meeting that followed would become the most consequential strategic discussion in hegemony history. His chief tactical officer presented the situation in blunt terms. The ground forces could not hold. Evacuation under fire would result in significant additional casualties, and the humans showed no signs of accepting any negotiated outcome short of complete hegemony withdrawal. Then he presented the 2 options. The first was orbital bombardment. The Throne of Silence carried enough firepower to sterilize the surface of Earth from pole to pole, turning every city, every forest, every ocean into a sea of molten glass. The planet's resources could still be harvested afterward once the surface cooled. And the hegemony's laws explicitly permitted the destruction of Deathworld species that resisted annexation. It was legal, it was doctrinally sound, and it would solve the problem permanently. The second option was full retreat. Evacuate every surviving soldier, leave the system entirely, and classify Sol as a permanent exclusion zone, a place that no hegemony vessel would ever enter again. This option would mean abandoning billions of credits worth of military equipment on the ground surface, accepting the largest ground defeat in centuries, and facing the political consequences back home. The room was divided, but the loudest voice belonged to Sub-Commander Kellis Drawn. Kellis had changed in 2 weeks. The bright confidence was gone, replaced by something harder and darker. A brittle intensity that came from watching an operation she had authorized turn into a catastrophe. She had not slept much either, and the guilt was eating her alive. But she had converted that guilt into conviction, and her conviction pointed in one direction. "We must bombardment the surface," she said, and her voice was steady, even though her hands were not. "I understand the moral weight of what I am proposing, but consider the alternative. If we leave Earth intact, if we allow this species to survive, they will develop faster than light travel. They went from horse-drawn vehicles to nuclear weapons in less than 2 centuries, Admiral. Give them another century, and they will be in our space. And when they arrive, they will not come to talk." She looked around the room and saw that several officers were nodding. "They will come for revenge," she said. "They will remember what we did here, and they will come for us, and they will bring with them every ounce of that fury, and that creativity, and that absolute refusal to die that has been destroying our legions for the past 2 weeks. We cannot allow that to happen. We must end this now, while we still can." Her argument was logical, and Vyrath knew it. The behavioral models supported her conclusion. A species with humanity's aggression, adaptability, and technological acceleration rate would almost certainly develop interstellar capability within a few generations, and a species that had been invaded would almost certainly use that capability to project force outward. Every piece of data pointed to the same conclusion. Leaving Earth intact was a strategic risk of the highest order. The room waited for Vyrath's decision. He said nothing for a long time. He sat in his chair and looked at the tactical display, and thought about 30,000 soldiers, and 11 species conquered, and 60 years of service, and the weight of a civilization's expectations pressing down on him, like Earth's gravity pressed down on the troops below. And then he did something that no one in the room expected. He pulled up a live feed from the planet's surface. The feed came from a downed hegemony scout drone, one of hundreds that had been shot down or crashed during the invasion. This one had landed in a field outside a human city called Kyoto, on the island nation of Japan, and its camera was still functioning, still transmitting, still recording everything that happened in front of it. Soldier was wounded, badly, with burns across his torso and a shattered leg, and he was clearly dying. He had been left behind during a retreat, abandoned by his unit in the chaos, and he had been lying in that field for what appeared to be several hours. The humans were trying to save him. They did not have the right medicine. Hegemony biology was alien to them, and their medical supplies were designed for their own species. But they were trying anyway, with a desperate improvised compassion that made Vyrath's throat tighten. They had wrapped the soldier in blankets to keep him warm. They had given him water from their own bottles. They had applied their own painkillers to his wounds, even though they had no idea if the drugs would work on alien physiology. A woman who appeared to be a doctor was examining the soldier's injuries with careful hands, speaking to him in a language he could not understand, but in a tone that was unmistakably gentle, holding the soldier's hand and would not let go. And a child, a small girl who could not have been more than 7 or 8 years old, was kneeling beside the alien and offering him a rice ball, holding it out with both hands and a serious expression on her face, as if feeding a wounded enemy was the most important thing in the world. The soldier was crying. Hegemony soldiers were not supposed to cry. It was considered a sign of weakness. But this one was crying freely, and the humans around him did not mock him for it. They just held him closer. Vyrath stared at that image for a very long time. The room was completely silent. Every officer was watching the feed, and something was happening in that room that was difficult to describe. Something that military doctrine had no framework for. Something that happened when people who had spent their lives thinking of other species as obstacles or resources or threats were suddenly confronted with the reality that those species were also people. Vyrath turned off the feed. He looked at Kellis, and there was something in his eyes that she had never seen before. Something that might have been sorrow, or might have been resolve, or might have been both. "Full retreat," he said. "Evacuate every soldier we can reach. We are leaving." Kellis opened her mouth to protest, and Vyrath raised a hand. "That is my decision, Sub-Commander, and it is final." The evacuation began within the hour. Dropships descended through increasingly hostile skies to extract the surviving troops, taking fire from human anti-aircraft batteries the entire way down and the entire way back up. Some of the dropships were shot down, and the soldiers aboard them were lost, and Vyrath felt every single death like a wound in his own body. But he did one more thing before the fleet departed the Sol system. He opened a communications channel aimed at the planet's surface. Hegemony to Earth transmission in history, and he broadcast a single data packet on every frequency the humans were known to monitor. The packet contained 3 things: a complete copy of the Hegemony star charts showing the locations of every known civilization in the galaxy, a cipher key for the Hegemony's primary language that would allow the humans to decode any Hegemony communication they intercepted, and the coordinates of 14 other spacefaring species, along with brief assessments of their technological capabilities and diplomatic dispositions. It was a gift. It was also an apology. And it was also a warning. The final line of the transmission, written in the human language called English, said simply, "You are not alone. Prepare yourselves." Then the throne of silence turned away from Earth and jumped to faster than light, and the Sol system was quiet again, except for the sound of a world beginning to rebuild and a species beginning to look upward with new eyes and a purpose that burned hotter than any star. P. Bray Bray. 50 years is not a long time in the life of a galaxy, but it is long enough for a species to change everything. The galactic hegemony had spent those 50 years watching the Sol system with a mixture of fascination and dread, monitoring humanity's progress through long-range observation probes that they kept carefully outside the system's boundaries, because they had learned the hard way what happened when you crossed into human territory without permission. The data those probes sent back was analyzed by entire departments of scientists and military strategists, and every year the reports grew more alarming. Humanity had achieved faster-than-light travel 31 years after the invasion, which shattered every existing model of technological progression. The galactic average for a species to move from primitive rocketry to FTL was approximately 400 years, and the fastest previously recorded was 112. Humanity did it in 31. When the hegemony's scientists reviewed the data, they realized that the humans had not just invented FTL on their own. They had used the star charts and language cipher that Admiral Vyrath had transmitted during the retreat as a foundation, reverse engineering hegemony principles from a single data packet the way they had reverse engineered hegemony weapons on the battlefield. Within a decade of achieving FTL, humanity had established colonies on 7 worlds, built a unified planetary government called the United Earth Confederacy, and constructed a fleet that made the hegemony's Naval Intelligence Division issue a classified report with the understated title Revised Threat Assessment Sol 3. The report was 400 pages long, and its conclusion could be summarized in one sentence. Humanity was now a major galactic power, and pretending otherwise was no longer an option. The hegemony's ruling council debated for 2 years about how to handle the situation, finally deciding to send a diplomatic vessel to make first formal contact. Not an invasion force, not a show of strength, just a single ship carrying an envoy and a message of peace, because the council had read the old reports from the ground invasion, and they understood that provoking humanity again would be an act of civilizational suicide. The diplomatic vessel was called the Gentle Approach, and its captain was a careful officer named Silas, who had been chosen specifically for her calm temperament and her ability to remain composed under pressure. She would need both qualities in abundance. The Gentle Approach dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Sol system and immediately transmitted its diplomatic credentials on every standard frequency, identifying itself as a peaceful vessel with no weapons and no hostile intent. The transmission was answered within 4 minutes, which meant the humans had detected them the instant they arrived, and the response came not from Earth, but from a ship that was already waiting for them. The ship was the UES Torvon's Folly. Captain Salis saw it on her display screen and had to grip the arms of her chair to keep herself steady. The human battlecruiser was enormous, at least 3 times the mass of the Gentle Approach, and it was built in a way that was completely different from any ship in the hegemony fleet. Where hegemony vessels were sleek and elegant with smooth curves and minimal external features, the human ship was angular and heavy and bristling with weapons, its hull thick with layered armor plating and its surface studded with sensor arrays and point defense turrets that tracked the Gentle Approach the moment it appeared. It was not a beautiful ship. It was a ship built by a species that had learned through bitter experience that the galaxy was dangerous, and it was designed with a single philosophy: survive first, look pretty never. But what made Captain Salis excuse herself to the lavatory and stand there for several minutes with her hands braced against the wall was not the ship's appearance, it was its power output. The Gentle Approach's sensors detected an energy signature from the human vessel that exceeded the output of the hegemony heavy cruiser by a factor of 3. and the ship was running at what appeared to be idle, not even at combat readiness, just cruising along at the edge of the solar system like a guard dog that had not yet decided whether to bark or bite. When Salis returned to the bridge, she ordered her crew to be very, very polite. The human escort, because that was clearly what it was, an escort, not a greeting, guided the gentle approach inward through the Sol system, past defensive stations and patrol ships and orbital platforms that bristled with enough firepower to glass a moon. All the way to Earth orbit, where the blue-green world that had once been invaded hung in space looking exactly as it had 50 years ago. Except now, it was surrounded by a ring of stations and shipyards, and the constant traffic of a civilization that had exploded outward into the stars with a speed that still defied explanation. The hegemony envoy, a senior diplomat named Counselor Preth, was transferred to the human battlecruiser via shuttle, and from the moment he stepped aboard the Torvan's Folly, he understood that this was not just a ship. It was a statement. The corridors were wide and clean and functional, lined with displays showing star maps and fleet dispositions, and in one long hallway that he was escorted through on the way to the conference room, a series of memorial cases mounted on the walls. Each case contained an artifact from the invasion, preserved behind glass with a small plaque describing its significance. There was a shard of hegemony body armor, scorched and cracked, recovered from the ruins of Frankfurt. There was a tattered flag from one of the human nations that had fought in the siege, its colors faded, but still visible. There was a hegemony energy cell that had been converted into a human weapon, displayed alongside the original detonator that a teenage engineering student had built. And there was a child's drawing, done in colored wax sticks on white paper, showing a crude alien figure with too many arms and big round eyes. And around the figure, the child had drawn a heart in red, and the plaque beneath it read, "Drawn by Yuki Tanaka, age 7, Kyoto, during the occupation." She offered a rice ball to a wounded hegemony soldier. The soldier survived and was evacuated. Counselor Preth stood in front of that drawing for a long time and felt something moving in his chest that he did not have a word for. The conference room was simple and unadorned. A long table, chairs designed for multiple species, a window that showed the stars. The human delegation was already seated, and at their head was a woman who stood when Preth entered, extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Her name was Ambassador Lena Voss, and she was 62 years old, with silver-streaked dark hair and steady brown eyes, and the kind of calm that came not from indifference, but from having survived things that should have broken her. Her grandmother had been in Berlin during the invasion, had lived through the bombing and the occupation and the liberation, and had spent the rest of her life making sure her granddaughter understood what had happened and why it mattered. Ambassador Voss smiled when she shook the counselor's hand, and the smile was warm, and that warmth was more unsettling to Preth than any weapon could have been, because he had come here expecting anger, and instead he found something he did not know how to process. He began his prepared remarks, the formal apology that the Hegemony's Council had spent 2 years drafting, every word carefully chosen to acknowledge fault without creating legal liability, the kind of diplomatic language that said much and meant little. Ambassador Voss let him speak for exactly 90 seconds, and then she raised her hand, gently, and he stopped. She reached across the table and slid a data tablet toward him. The tablet contained a document, Humanity's Proposed Treaty for Formal Relations between Earth and the Galactic Hegemony, and it was comprehensive. Mutual defense pacts, trade agreements, technology exchange programs, cultural embassies, immigration protocols, joint scientific research initiatives, and a framework for dispute resolution that was more detailed and more fair than anything the hegemony had ever offered to a junior species. Preth read through the document with growing astonishment, because this was not the treaty of a conquered people seeking protection, and it was not the treaty of an angry people seeking revenge. It was the treaty of an equal, confident, and thorough, and built on the assumption that both sides had something to gain from cooperation. But there was one clause at the very beginning that was marked as non-negotiable, and when Preth read it, he understood that the smile on Ambassador Voss's face was not softness, it was strength. Article 1. The Galactic Hegemony formally recognizes Earth as a sovereign world, and acknowledges that the unprovoked invasion of Sol 3 was an act of illegal aggression. In perpetuity, no hegemony vessel shall enter Sol space without explicit human consent. Preth read the clause twice. He looked at Ambassador Voss, and she looked back at him with those steady brown eyes, and he understood that this was the one thing that could not be negotiated. Not now, not ever. This was the line, drawn in the memory of everyone who had died during the invasion, and it would stand as long as humanity existed. He signed it. The ceremony was brief and dignified, and when it was over, the human delegation shook hands with the hegemony. Delegation. And there were photographs taken and formal statements recorded, and then Counselor Preth was escorted back to his shuttle. But before he left, Ambassador Voss walked with him to the airlock. And in that quiet corridor between the conference room and the shuttle bay, she said one last thing. "We could have come to you with a war fleet, Counselor. We spent 30 years building ships and weapons. And believe me when I tell you that there were voices on Earth who wanted exactly that, who wanted to find the hegemony and burn it the way you tried to burn us. But we chose to come with a treaty instead. I need you to remember that." Preth looked at her, and he saw in her face the echo of every human he had read about in the invasion reports. The soldiers who fought with laughter and fury, the engineers who built weapons from scraps, the child who offered a rice ball to a dying alien. All of it, a rage and a mercy, existing in the same species, in that same person, at the same time. "I will remember," he said. He returned to the gentle approach and made the journey back to hegemony space, and when he arrived, he went directly to visit one person before filing his official report. Fleet Admiral Virith Selenis, retired now, old and slow, living in a quiet residence on the hegemony homeworld with a view of the mountains, received Counselor Preth on his balcony, where he sat in a chair that supported his aging body and looked out at a sky that seemed smaller than it used to. Preth told him everything: the battle cruiser, the memorial corridor, the child's drawing behind glass, the treaty, the ambassador's words, and when he was finished, he asked the question that he had been carrying since the moment he stepped aboard the Torvon's Folly. "What do you think of them, Admiral? You are the only one of us who has faced them. What are they?" Vyrath was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the mountains, and the light shifted across the sky, and the old Admiral thought about a blue-green world, and a girl with a rice ball, and a species that had every reason to destroy the galaxy, and chose not to. "I think," he said slowly, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent 50 years living with a single decision that had saved 2 civilizations, "that they are exactly as dangerous as I feared." He paused and looked at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "And far more merciful than we deserved." Somewhere out in the black, aboard a ship named after a dead commander's failure, Ambassador Lena Voss stood at a window and watched the hegemony vessel jump to FTL and disappear. She touched the glass with her fingertips and thought about her grandmother and the stories she used to tell about the day the sky opened and everything changed. Then she turned away from the window and went back to work, because there was a galaxy out there full of species who had never met humanity, and every single one of them was going to learn the same lesson that the hegemony had learned 50 years ago, in blood and fire and unexpected grace. That the little blue world in the Orion Spur was not just a death world. It was home to a species that would fight like demons and forgive like saints. And that was the most terrifying and beautiful thing the galaxy had ever seen.